Holes. Chapter 1. There's no Camp Green Lake. There once was a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. That was over 100 years ago. Now it's just a dry, flat wasteland. There used to be a town of Green Lake as well. The town shriveled and dried up, along with the lake and the people who lived there. During the summer, daytime temperatures hover around 95 degrees in the shade. If you can find any shade. There's not much shade in a big dry lake. The only trees are two old oak trees on the eastern edge of the lake. A hammock is stretched between the two trees, and a log cabin stands behind that. The campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock. It belongs to the warden. The warden owns the shade. Out on the lake, rattlesnakes and scorpions find shade under rocks and holes dug by campers. Here is a good rule to remember about rattlesnakes and scorpions. If you don't bother them, they won't bother you, usually. Being bitten by a scorpion or even a rattlesnake is not the worst thing that can happen to you. You won't die, usually. Sometimes a camper will try to be bitten by a scorpion or even a small rattlesnake. Then gets to spend a day or two recovering in his tent instead of having to dig a hole out on the lake. But you don't want to be bitten by a yellow-spotted lizard. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. You will die a slow and painful death. Always. If you get bitten by a yellow-spotted lizard, you might as well go back to the shade of oak tree and lie in the hammock. There's nothing anyone can do to you anymore. Chapter 2. The reader is probably asking, why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? Most campers weren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. If you take a bad boy and make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, that will turn him into a good boy. That was what some people thought. Stanley Yellowns was given a choice. The judge says you may go to jail or Camp Green Lake. Stanley had a poor family. He had never been to camp before. Chapter 3. Stanley Yellownuts was the only passenger on the bus, but not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver with his seat turned around facing Stanley. A rifle lay across his lap. Stanley was sitting about 10 rows back, handcuffed to his armrest. His backpack lay on the seat next to him. It contained his toothbrush, toothpaste, a box of stationery his mother had given him. He promised to ride her at least once a week. He looked out the window, although there wasn't much to see, mostly fields and hay and cotton. He was on a long bus ride to nowhere. The bus wasn't air-conditioned and hot, heavy air almost stifling as the handcuffs. Stanley and his parents had tried to pretend that he was going away to camp for a while, just like the rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, he used to play with stuffed animals and pretend the animals were at camp. Camp fun and games, he called it. Sometimes he had them play soccer with a marble. Other times they run around an obstacle course or bungee jumping off a table. Tied to broken rubber bands, now Stanley tried to pretend he was going to have fun and games. Maybe he'd make some friends. He thought at least he'd get to swim in the lake. He didn't have any friends at home. He was overweight, and the kids at his middle school often teased him about his size. Even teachers made cruel comments without realizing it. On his last day of school, his math teacher, Mrs. Bell, taught radius. As an example, they chose heaviest kid in the class and the lightest kid in the class, and then had them weigh themselves. Stanley weighed 3 times as much as the other boys. Miss Bell wrote the ratio on the board. 3 too, unaware of how much embarrassment she had caused both of them. Stanley was arrested later that day. He looked at the guard who slumped in his seat and wondered if he had fallen asleep. The guard was wearing sunglasses, so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. He'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was all because of no dirty rotten pig stealing great-great-grandfather. He smiled. It would be a family joke. It was a family joke. Whether anything went wrong, they always blamed Stanley. No good, dirty, rotten pig stealing great-great-grandfather. Supposedly, he had a great-great-grandfather who had stolen a pig from a one-legged gypsy, and she put a curse on him and all his descendants. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in the curses, of course, but whenever anything went wrong, it felt good to be able to blame someone. Things went wrong a lot. They always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He looked out the window at last, the vast emptiness. He watched the rise and fall of telephone wire. In his mind, he could hear his father's gruff voice softly singing to him, if only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was just a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, he cries, moon, moon, if only. It was a song his father used to sing to him. The melody was sweet and sad, but Stanley's favorite part was when his father would howl the word moon. The bus hit a small bump and the guard sat up, instantly alert. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be a successful inventor, you need 3 things: intelligence, perseverance, and just a little bit of luck. Stanley's father was smart and had a lot of perseverance. Once he started a project that he would work on for years. Often going days without sleep. He just never had any luck. Every time an experiment failed, Stanley can hear him cursing his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. Stanley's father also named Stanley Yeltons. Stanley's father's full name was Stanley Yeltons III. Our Stanley is Stanley Yeltons IV. Everyone in his family had always liked the fact that Stanley Yeltons was spelled the same way, forward and backwards. So they keep naming their sons Stanley. Stanley was an only child, as way every other Stanley Yeltons has been before him. All of them had something else in common. Despite their awful luck, they always remained hopeful. As Stanley's father liked to say, I learned from failure. But perhaps that was a part of the curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, it wouldn't hurt so much every time their hopes were crushed. Not every Stanley Yeltons had been a failure, Stanley's mother often pointed out. Whether Stanley or his father became discouraged or they actually started to believe in the curse. The first Stanley Yelton's great-grandfather, made a fortune in the stock market. He couldn't have been too unlucky. At such times, she neglected to mention the bad luck that had befell the first Stanley Yeltons. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving from New York to California. His stagecoach was robbed by an Katie Barlow. If it weren't for that, Stanley's family would be now living in a mansion on a beach in California. Instead, they were crammed in a tiny apartment, phlegmed or burning rubber and foot odor. If only the apartment smelled the way it did, because Stanley's father was trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. The first person who finds a use for old sneakers, he said, will be a very rich man. It was the latest project that led to Stanley's arrest. The bus ride came increasingly bumpy because the road was no longer paved. Actually, Stanley had been impressed when he first found out that his great-grandfather was robbed by kissing Kate Barrett. True, he would have preferred living on the beach in California, but it was still kind of cool to have someone in your family robbed by an outlaw. Kate Barlow didn't kiss Stanley's great-grandfather. That would have been really cool, but she only kissed the man she killed. Instead, she robbed him and left him stranded in the middle of the desert. He was lucky to have survived. Stanley's mother was quick to point out. The bus was slowing down. The guard grunted as he stretched his arms. "Welcome to Camp Green Lake," said the driver. Stanley looked out the dirty window. He couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. Stanley felt somewhat dazed as the guard unlocked his handcuffs and let him off the bus. "Had been on the bus for over 8 hours. Be careful," the bus driver said to Stanley as Stanley walked down the steps. Stanley wasn't sure if the bus driver meant for him to be careful going down the steps or if he was telling him to be careful at Camp Green Lake. "Thanks for the ride," he said. His mouth was dry and his throat hurt. He stepped onto the hard, dry dirt. There was a band of sweat around his wrist and where the handcuffs had been. The land was barren and desolated. He could see a few run-down buildings and some tents. Farther away, there was a cabin behind 2 tall trees. Those 2 trees were the only plant life he could see. There wasn't even weeds. Chapter 4. The guard led Stanley to a small building. A sign on front said, "You are entering Camp Green Lake, Juvenile Correction Facility." Next to it was another sign which declared that it had a violation of the Texas Penal Code to bring guns, explosive weapons, and drugs or alcohol into the premises. As Stanley read the sign, he couldn't help thinking, well, duh. The guard led Stanley into the building, where he felt the relief of air conditioning. The man was sitting with his feet up on his desk. He turned his head when Stanley and the guard entered, but otherwise didn't move. Even though he was inside, he wore sunglasses and a cowboy hat. He also held a can of soda, and the sight of it made Stanley even more aware of his thirst. He waited while the bus guard gave him the man some papers to sign. "That's a lot of sunflower seeds," the bus guard said. Stanley noticed a burp sack filled with sunflower seeds on the next to the desk. I quit smoking last month," said the man in the cowboy hat. He had a tattoo of a rattlesnake on his arm, and he signed his name. The rattlesnake seemed to wiggle. "I used to smoke a pack a day. Now I eat sacks of these every week." The guard laughed. There must have been a small refrigerator behind his desk because the man had produced 2 more cans of soda. For a second, Stanley hoped that one might be for him, but the man gave one to the guard and the other was for the driver. 9 hours here, and now 9 hours back?" the guard grumbled. "What a day." Stanley thought about the long, miserable bus ride and felt a little sorry for the guard and the bus driver. The man in the cowboy had split the sunflower shells seashells into waste paper basket. Then he walked around the desk to Stanley. "My name is Mr. Sir," he said. "Whenever you speak to me, you must call me my name. Is that clear?" Stanley hesitated. Yes, Mr. Sir," he said, though he couldn't imagine that that was really the man's name. "You're not in Girl Scouts anymore," Mr. Sir said. Stanley had to remove his clothes in front of Mr. Sir, who made sure he wasn't hiding anything. He was then given 2 sets of clothes and towel. Each set considered a long-sleeve orange jumpsuit and an orange t-shirt and yellow socks. Stanley wasn't sure if the socks had been yellow originally. He was also given white sneakers, an orange cap, and a canteen made out of heavy plastic, which was unfortunately was empty. The cap had a piece of cloth sewn on the back of it for neck protection. Stanley got dressed. The clothes smelled like soap. Mr. Sir told him he should wear 1 set to work and 1 set for relaxation. Laundry was done every 3 days. On that day, his work clothes would be washed, and the other set would become his work clothes, and he would get clean clothes to wear while resting. You dig 1 hole each day, including Saturdays and Sundays. Each hole must be 5 feet deep and 5 feet across in every direction. Your shovel is your measuring stick. Breakfast is served at 4:30. Stanley must have looked surprised because Mr. Sir went on to explain that they had started early to avoid the hottest part of the day. "No one is going to babysit you," he added. "The longer it takes you to dig, the longer you will be out in the sun. If you dig anything interesting, you are to report it to me or any other counselor. When you finish, the rest of the day is yours." Stanley nodded to show he understood. This isn't a Girl Scouts camp." He checked Stanley's backpack, allowing him to keep it. Then he led Stanley outside in the blazing heat. "Take a good look around you," Mr. Sir said. "What do you see?" Stanley looked across the vast wasteland. "The air seems thick and the heat and dirt." "Not much," he said, then hastily added, Mr. Sir." Mr. Sir laughed. "Do you see any guard towers?" "No." "How about the electric fences?" "No." "There's no fences at all, is there?" "No." Mr. Sir. "You want to run away?" Mr. Sir asked him. Stanley looked back at him, unsure what he meant. "If you want to run away, go ahead, start running. I'm not going to stop you." Stanley didn't know what kind of game Mr. Sir was playing. "If you're looking at my gun, don't worry. I'm not going to shoot you," he tapped his holster. "This is for a yellow-spotted lizard. I wouldn't waste a bullet on you." "I'm not going to run away." "Good thinking. Nobody runs away from here. We don't need a fence, because we got the only water for 100 miles. You wouldn't want to run away. You'll be blizzard for food in 3 days." Stanley could see some kids dressed in orange and carrying shovels and dragging themselves toward the tents. "You 30? "Yes, Mr. Sir," Stanley said gratefully. "Well, you better get used to it. You're going to be 30 for the next 18 months. There were 6 large gray tents. Each one had black letters on it, A, B, C, D, E, or F. The first 5 tents were for the campers. Counselors sat in F. Stanley was assigned to D tent. Mr. Paxson was his counselor. "My name is easy to remember," said Mr. Pandescli, as he shook hands with Stanley just outside the tent. 3 words: Pendanski. Pendanski. Mr. Sir returned to the office. Mr. Pendanski was younger than Mr. Sir, and not as nearly as scary looking. The top of his head was shaved so close it was almost bald, but his face was covered in thick curly black beard. His nose was badly sunburned. Chapter 5. Mr. Sir isn't really so bad, said Mr. Pendanski. He's just been in a bad mood ever since he quit smoking. The person you've got to worry about is the warden. There's really one rule at Camp Green Lake. Don't upset the warden. Stanley nodded as if he understood. I want you to know, Stanley, that I respect you, Mr. Pendanski said. I understand you made some bad mistakes in your life. Otherwise, you wouldn't have be here. But everyone does mistakes. You may have done some bad things, but that doesn't mean you're a bad kid. Stanley nodded. It seemed pointless to try and tell his counselor that he was innocent. He figured that everyone would probably say that he didn't want Pendanski to think he had a bad attitude. I think I'm going to help you turn your life around, said his counselor. But you're going to help. Can I count on your help? Yes, sir, Stanley said. Mr. Pendanski said. Good, and patted Stanley on the back. 2 boys, each carrying a shovel, were coming across the compound. Mr. Pendanski called to them. Rex, Alan, I want you to say hello to Stanley. He's the newest member of our team. The boys glanced weirdly at Stanley. They were dripping with sweat, and their faces were so dirty that it took Stanley a moment to notice that one kid was white and the other was black. What happened to Barf Bag? Louis is still in the hospital, said Mr. Pendanski. He won't be returning. He told the 2 boys to shake Stanley's hand and introduce themselves, like gentlemen. Hi, the white kid grunted. That's Alan, said Mr. Pendanski. My name's not Alan, it's Squid, and that's X-Ray. Hey, said X-Ray. He smiled and shook Stanley's hand. Stanley wondered how he could have seen out of them. Mr. Pendanski told Alan to go to the rec hall and bring the other boys to meet Stanley. Then he led him inside the tent. There were 7 cots, each one less than 2 feet from one next to it, which was Louis's cot. Barfback slept here, said X-Ray, kicking at one of the beds. All right, Stanley, that'll be yours, said Mr. Pendanski. Stanley looked at the cot and nodded. He wasn't particularly thrilled about sleeping in the same cot that had been usually used by someone named Barfbag. 7 crates were stacked into 2 piles at one side of the tent. The open end of the crate faced outward. Stanley put his backpack, change of clothes, and towel in what used to be Barfbag's crate. In the bottom of the stack that had 3 in it. Squid returned with 4 other boys. The first 3 were introduced by Mr. Pendanski as Joey, Throat, and Ricky. Called himself Magnet, Armpit, and Zigzag. They all have nicknames, explained Mr. Pendanski. However, I prefer to use the names parents gave them. The name society will recognize them by when they return to be useful and hardworking members of the society. It ain't just a nickname, X-Ray told Mr. Pendanski. He tapped the rim of his glass. I can see inside you. Mom, you have a big fat heart. The last boy either didn't have a real name or else he didn't have a nickname. Both Mr. Pendeski and X-Ray called him Zero. You know why his name is Zero? Asked Mr. Pendeski. Because there's nothing inside his head. He smiled and painfully shook Zero's shoulder. Zero said nothing. And that's Mom, a boy said. Mr. Pendeski smiled at him. If that makes you feel better to call me Mom, they go ahead and call me Mom. He turned to Stanley. If you have questions, Theodore will help you. You've got that, Theodore. I'm depending on you. Theodore spit a thin line of saliva between his teeth, causing some of the other boys to complain about the need to keep their homes sanitary. You were all new here once, said Mr. Pendeski, and you all know what it feels like. I'm counting on every one of you to help Stanley. Stanley looked at the ground. Mr. Pendeski left the tent, and soon the other boys began to file out as well, taking their towels and change of clothes with them. Stanley was relieved to be left alone, but he was so thirsty that he would die if he didn't get some drink soon. Hey, Theodore, do you know where I can fill my canteen? Theodore grabbed and wheeled Shelly by his collar. My name is Theodore. It's Armpit. He threw Stanley to the ground. Stanley stared up at him, terrified. There was a water-sick spot in the wall of the shower spot. Thanks, Armpit, said Stanley. He watched the boy turn and walk away. He couldn't for the life of him figure out why anyone wanted to be called Armpit. In a way, it made him feel a little better about having to sleep in a cot that had been used by someone named Barfbag. Maybe it was a term of respect. Chapter 6. This is the end of this video. Bye!